Hey y'all! Lately I've been monitoring this website called Jiaoqiu, which compiles the most efficient clears for the 3 endgame modes. You can even sort to include and exclude certain characters based on different qualities, which reveals some pretty interesting results I'll get to in a moment. These clears include your standard 3-star clears, 0 cycles, and other speedruns, and are often sorted by their modified version of cost. Overall, I really admire the work that they do. Heck, I've even submitted a few clears for fun, and they've been pretty swift at adding them to the site's database. But, as I was pouring through clears, one particular statistic stuck out for me. The Herda can 0-cycle Pure Fiction Shepard with as few as 2 limited 5-star units, including herself, and Hule with 3. But take away a single unit, and that requirement jumps up to both 6 and 4 respectively. Who do you think that unit is? Well, of course, it's Tribi. Wait, what do you mean that's only half true? Well, believe it or not, the unit I'm actually referring to is Remembrance MC. Despite not being a limited unit themselves, Remembrance MC is perfectly capable of compensating for not just a limited 5-star, but also their signature light cone and potentially even more. I've been running through a series of slides at this point to illustrate the sheer disparity between RMC and RMC list runs. Obligatory disclaimer that Jiaoqiu's archive is not complete and that it is a data collection website first and foremost. The opinions in my video are my own and not representative of the websites, and both of us have public ways to reach out if you have questions for either party. With that out of the way, what is RMC's true cost then? Well, it's twofold. First is the inability to run RMC on the other side, and second, the inability to run any other MC forms, most notably Harmony MC. This restriction that comes with cheaper units like RMC being unable to be used on multiple sides, and how more expensive limited units can provide value just by being their Sidegrade or complementary upgrade that takes up a team slot, is what truly gives niche ports their true value. Let's talk about the Harmony form's most hotly contested Sidegrade, Fugue. Truthfully, Fugue usually isn't an HMC Sidegrade. Most break teams really love 2 toughness bars to break. And yes, that includes Firefly at all Eidolon levels, seeing as how fire breaks deal the highest damage of any element, tying with physical, as well as her ability to stack lots of break effect. Particularly worth noting is the interaction with Exo breaks in Apocalyptic Shadow. The break damage from initially breaking an AS boss happens before the weakness broken window, but Exo breaks occur during this window, when double the damage is received. This results in about a 2.22 times difference when also accounting for weakness breaks 1.11 times damage multiplier, or more if also ignoring damage reduction mechanics like Hule's. In other words, you could be missing out on 500k to 1 million Exo break nukes due to how this game mode works. I don't think I need to tell you that's a lot of front-loaded damage. The only time that Fugue becomes more comparable to HMC is when fights drag on, as HMC offers higher super break scalings versus lower enemy counts, personal super break damage via their more spammable skill, and the ability to run dance. And while Fugue's Eidolon, should you go for them, make all of these points moot anyways. Not to mention that HMC benefits so much from double toughness bars, and super break scaling is such a rare stat that it's hard to oversaturate at the moment, so honestly you'd rather just run the 2 of them together. However, even in the worst case scenario of E0 S0 Fugue, as we've just established, the ability to even Sidegrade HMC proves to be very valuable. If nothing else, it opens up the ability to access RMC on your account, allowing your Super Break team to have very little, if any, overlap between your crit teams. And that very well could be the case between RMC and whatever next MC Hoyo has planned in store. And best case scenario, it unlocks a whole echelon of clears that Fugue's Exo Breaks uniquely allow for. Sure, mostly at E1 and above, but even E0 Fugue is a major upgrade if you're willing to run sustainless. That being said, what if you want to run a break sustain? Well, that's where the next unit we'll be talking about comes into play. Upon her initial release, Lingsha received mixed reception. Being the 5th limited sustain in a time where most accounts needed, and usually already had, only 1 to 2, she was a hard sell, strictly meta-wise at least. A lot of the general sentiment among people skipping her was the idea that, oh, I already have a free 4-star Fire Abundance break support. Why should I feel the need to pull for a marginal upgrade? Or even insinuating that she was a downgrade in certain areas, like number of debuffs, SD positivity, quid pro quo procs, and the ability to resist CCs thrown upon herself. All this was technically true, sure, but some comparisons didn't paint the full picture. First, she was much more AoE in nature compared to Gallagher, meaning that in AoE content, she could act as a way more competent break-sub DPS, clearing waves of enemies in pure fiction. Her frequent AoE attacking nature let her also be a hit count generator, potentially acting as an avenging Sidegrade on follow-up teams, Jade's best partner in crime, and later being truly capitalized on teams with the Herta and Trippy present. Not to mention that being a limited healer, her sustaining capability was much more consistent and high output than Gallagher's, providing more consistency with lower stat requirements for casterist teams, and straight up outclassing him in scenarios with constant spawns like Flame Reaver or Pure Fiction. All of this meant that, especially for players who lack limited sustains like Aventurine or Huohuo, she fulfilled a very different niche from Gallagher. It was occasionally memed back in the day that Lingsha's best purpose was to allow Gallagher to sustain the other side, but quite unironically, that ended up being very true. To this day, Gallagher still handles SP, debuffs, quid pro quo procs, and self-CC resist better, while Lingsha handles healing, AoE toughness damage, and AoE hit count better. Despite their overlapping niches in Break, the two of them actually have pretty solid performance outside of said overlap, which is really nice considering that Break isn't exactly meta without significant vertical investment nowadays. And sure, outside of Break teams, you could argue that Lingsha can just be replaced by Hyacine, but 1. Lingsha can still beat out Hyacine for sheer AoE attack frequency due to offensive AoE skills and emergency Fuyuans. 2. Hyacine is such a massive upgrade for casterists that being able to use your Lingsha on your big Herta and or Jade teams, freeing up Cassie to be with her fellow Amphorius friend, is value in and of itself. And 3. Even if Hyacine was a strict Lingsha upgrade, they were separated by 6 whole patches. Speaking of strict limited upgrades separated by more than 5 patches though, I've already dunked on Jiaoqiu enough in my previous videos, particularly surrounding his lackluster amp, so let's actually look at his positives around the time of his release. And even today, dare I say. At the time of his release, Jiaoqiu fulfilled a unique role of being the second consistent AoE Nihility debuffer. This meant that for E0 Acheron mains, pulling him was a snap pick, especially considering his functionality at E0 S0, and his S1 being generally preferred over his E1, meaning that it was cheaper and honestly just as effective to pick him up before E2ing your Acheron. And well, this is in part because E2ing your Acheron didn't actually do too much on its own. Sure, the 1 extra stack per turn is nice, but in order to truly make the most out of your E2, you'd have to replace one of your Nihility units with the Harmony unit. And well, in a time where Sparkle, Ranmei, and Robin were the only limited 5-star harmonies, it wasn't uncommon for E2 Acheron to just steal limited supports that were essential to letting other teams function. Break supports, like Harmony MC and Ranmei, thankfully ran into this issue a bit less, with Super Break being as strong and independent as it was at the time, but Mei's universality meant that you probably missed having her on your other side regardless. Heck, if you're willing to go sustainless, E0 Acheron, especially with Jiaoqiu, was oftentimes not very far behind E2 Acheron, simply because the lower HP pools of the time favored double Nihility's mechanics, rarer buffs, and fast independent stack generation paired with a single Harmony, about as much as 1 Nihility plus 2 Harmonies. It's only when Harmony Eidolons are added to the equation that the class really starts significantly pulling its weight over Nihility, an expensive prospect after also having just E2'd your Acheron. I'd go as far as to say that at the time of her release, Acheron's E2 was whalebait. Her ability to leverage rarely used Nihilities was a strength, and pulling 2 additional copies to ignore that aspect of her kit was a strategy that only whales and vertical investors could really capitalize on. For many more, Jiaoqiu was just the natural option, especially seeing as how his amp was way more consistent, without periods of alt downtime and uptime to manage like Ranmei and Robin needed. The question then becomes, how well does that sentiment hold today? After all, the number of limited harmonies has increased from 3 to 5, or 6 if you count Remembrance MC as a pseudo-limited harmony, so having enough across your account to prevent harmony overlap is much more plausible now. Well, as always, if you can't beat 'em, join 'em. 3 of the 4 Acheron supporting Nihilities, Jiaoqiu included, are made to spam ults, possessing high attack frequency and energy generation as a result, most notably when paired with Eagle. High attack frequency makes them great with Robin, while printing out energy makes them great with RMC. Their ability to provide rare buffs also allows them to amp Trivy's personal HP scaling damage, which is not insignificant, especially where pure fiction is concerned. Their debuffs also don't conflict, with Sparkle's less than 2-turn crit damage buff duration, and their toughness damage lets them play well with Ron Mei, especially when bringing Jiaoqiu versus Choir and other fire-weak bosses like AS Sunday. And well, as for playable Sunday, there are some funny things you can do since Nihilities are not harmonies, but generally I'd say he's the exception to Nihility synergies as a pure hypercarry, non-damage dealing buffer. Though I guess Nihility's defense shred looks a lot better if you have his E1 and E2 Sparkle too. Okay, clarifying what I've said in previous vids about Pure Fiction's vulnerability buffs actually diluting Xiaoqiu's amps by a significant amount, which Tribi definitely doesn't help with either. Yes, it's true, but also keep in mind that Xiaoqiu's Permadot has insane synergy with Solitary Healing, making his ult regen even crazier at E0S0 and Acheron debuffing capabilities even spammier, which is doubly beneficial when your grid buffs are ult-centered. And yes, Solitary isn't a damaged amp cone either, so this really only comes into play if your relics are really good, and or you have significant vertical investment to overcome the damage hurdle, meaning that Xiaoqiu's best niche in Pure Fiction is once again with Sustainless with Acheron teams, since Trend Sustains directly compete for his role and make his lacking amp feel even more apparent. And before I forget, grid mechanics were introduced in 2.7, meaning that Jiaoqiu had a good 3 patches before his amp was a problem he had to worry about. Silver lining, I guess. I still do think he needs a buff to his amp though. Speaking of that 4th Acheron supporting Nihility who can't spam ults though, let's look at Cipher. Between her and the newly buffed Silverwolf, Nihility now has 2 good units with utility and access to consistent and rare amp multipliers. In fact, in matters of pure amp alone, they can compete with most Harmony units at E0, especially if running Sustainless setups where Harmony overlap starts to show its problems. Here's Tribi's amp for comparison. Keep in mind that due to wielding Defense Shred, both the Cat's and Wolf's relative amps still have room to go even higher with multiple sources of it. And sure, Harmonies have more than amp, but Nihilities also tap much more into attack mechanics, and help break up cases with multiple single target buffers whose buff uptimes get messed up due to an excess of DPS turns. With the immediate turn having DPS meta we've been somewhat experiencing lately, it can be pretty nice for your debuffs to be based on enemy turns and not your own. Also, having multiple AoE buffers on the same team who want to be slow, but also want active teammates to best capitalize on their mechanics seems a bit counterintuitive. Good thing Nihilities are pretty active, right? All this is to say that our 2 limited quantum Nihilities have legitimately earned themselves a seat at the table with the Harmonies in terms of pull value. Not just that, but they're very nice complements, not competitors, for supporting the whole team. Especially with the HP scaling, damage soaking meta going on lately, it's nice to have characters with non-attack related and built-in damage reduction debuffs too. I'm not kidding when I say that Jiaoqiu can legitimately be used to enable Cipher and Silverwolf for your other non-Acheron team. Their ability to replace and pair with other supports, including themselves, is pretty strong. Heck, if you're using Acheron, it's not even that hard to fit all 3 amping Nihilities into your entire endgame roster. If you're not feeling in the mood for just one weakness implant though, or heck you'd rather be supporting a different emanator, well, Anaxa's got you covered. However, unlike other supports we've discussed so far, Anaxa's X Factor is truly unique. Rather than staying as a supportive Sidegrade, he can split off and become his own DPS, should his strength and pure single target be required where the Herda's AoE falters. A lot of initial criticisms going towards Anaxa's way generally stem from the notion that his dual role he plays as a support DPS, able to switch between one and the other, meant that he was inadequate at doing both. After all, many Herda straight outclasses him as a pure fiction sub DPS, and so do Argenti and Jade for that matter. But unlike those units, Anaxa's single target specialty actually makes him more favorable with turn doublers and action advanced units. The exact units that, with the exception of RMC, the Herda doesn't really care as much for. To illustrate this further, let's list their ideal supports in a hypercarry setups. For Harmonies, the Herda wants Tribi first and foremost. Anaxa wants Robin along with Sunday or even Bronya, as basics don't change his rotation, and often neither do Sunday ults. Best sustains, the Herda wants Lingsha while Anaxa wants Gallagher. Other sustains like Aventurine and Hyacine can work for both, but may generally prefer one or the other due to SP demand. Best eruditions, the Herda can use herself, Serval, Argenti, or Jade best without the Feeble Scholar. Anaxa, of course, wants none eruditions to preserve his massive 150% crit damage steroid, but even the one erudition that capitalizes on his unique weakness implants, Himeko, isn't part of the Herta's ideal roster. All of this is to say that Anaxa isn't necessarily built to push forth the Herta's biggest strengths, but more so to cover her most glaring weaknesses. And if for some reason he can't do enough as a sub DPS, he'll just split off and make his own team, leaving the other side and other buffers to his fellow erudite. In other words, the opportunity cost for running Anaxa with the Herta, provided you have the infrastructure, is virtually zero. If it's inconvenient to pair the two together, no one's forcing it upon you. They can split up as needed, and therein, my opinion, lies Anaxa's true value. And well, let's just say that said value is only skyrocketing with Cerydra's release. The fact that the livestream chose to highlight Cerydra's synergies with Phynon and Anaxa, but no one else, is quite telling. The ability to double skills is quite strong, yes, but the amount of characters that we see huge benefit from back-to-back skills is not only few, but so exclusive that it makes sense to think that she's going to be our first ever niche limited Harmony, lacking general strength on her release. After all, giving her Robin level generic buffs when she already boosts crit damage and res pen on double skills sounds like a recipe for disaster. Well, that's what happened with Robin as a comparison to Ron May, so what the heck do I know about Harmony balancing? As such, if you've been keeping up with any meta discussion whatsoever recently, it's clear that people aren't exactly endorsing her power level, since her being best in slot for only 2 DPSs rings a bit close in home in terms of what Jiaoqiu experienced. But using what we've learned so far, even right now her strength to enable stronger supports for other teams rather than directly competing with them is worth considering as well. And while I don't ever recommend pulling to plan ahead for an uncertain future, it's very possible that she'll get more use cases with skill-focused DPS later down the line, starting with Anaxa and Phynon, and then expanding, much like how Lingsha's first cases were with Jade and Break, and then expanded with the Herta. Cerydra just needs a DPS who can either skill spam, or has a high cost and payoff per skill used. But enough speculation, let's look at her now. At the moment, both Phynon and Anaxa teams can make especially solid use of Sunday, RMC, Robin, Tingyan, and Bronya. While Tingyan and Bronya have admittedly more niche use cases, and are more so linchpins for low-cost speedruns over general gameplay, Cerydra being able to replace any of the higher priority targets in a team is a huge boon. And unique to herself, the fact that her skills are classified as extra actions means that she works well in tandem with single-target action advanced supports, whose main pitfall is that pairing one or more of them together, more often than not, results in some period of buff downtime. Not only that, but just like RMC, she can double a character's action independent of her own turn, freeing her from the burden of -1 speed setups. Plus, she also gives a DPS speed, which I have a feeling will allow for some interesting rotations. On the low end, even Ron May's 10% AoE speed boost is pretty significant, as well as Robin's 16% AoE on her E2 for hitting their next breakpoints. And on the higher end, Bronya's 30% speed boost is a defining part of her E2, even though it's only single target. No matter how high or how wide Cerydra's speed boost ends up being, I do have a feeling that it'll be impactful in some way, even if it's as small as just enabling attack boots in Anaxa or Phynon. Another trait that Cerydra shares with RMC, though, is the ability to gain charge from her ult. While Cerydra only gains 33% of her full charge by ulting, versus RMC's 40+%, both are far from 0%, unlike other harmonies, and the fact that DPS gain much more charge through their own actions with Cerydra over RMC means that both characters will probably see similar amounts of gain from external energy buffs, such as AS's ult refund on break. Whether you see this as a strength or a potential way to show Cerydra is up to how the situation is framed, but it is a legitimate advantage she can seize upon. And if we're reaching, she has an offensive ult, and the ability to carry an extra skill over into Wave 2 could also be relevant. Kinda like a super budget Cipher. So besides the relevance of Cerydra coming up, why bring this up now? Well, the new Endgame mode, Anomaly Arbitration, has just been teased, and while it is a completely optional challenge, no Jade's lock behind it as of recording this video, it is still Endgame, and something certain players might want to prepare for. As such, the fact that it is our first 3-team Endgame mode means that, while replacement supports are going to start to see a rise in meta value, without quote-unquote Sidegrade characters like Fugue, Lingsha, Jiaoqiu, Cipher, Anaxa, and Cerydra, who make the hugest difference when replacing existing Generalist characters, a lot of players will probably struggle to fill out 3 competent teams with best-in-slot supports. Sure, RMC is great and cheap, but you can't use them on every team, which especially hurts with the addition of a third game mode, hence the need for niche supports. Limited units can still be budget replacements if teams are stretched thin enough, and perhaps we need to evaluate the strength of Sidegrade units once more with a new endgame on the horizon. In fact, I have a feeling that DOT will also see a resurgence in meta value for this very reason, something Guoba has picked up on already. Triple Dot seems like it'll be pretty competitive now, given what we know of Heiselin's kit, and the Heiselin Kafka Black Swan trio has basically no overlap with any other teams, especially if running a sustain on the 4th slot, which is almost mandatory anyways due to the archetype's insane squishiness paired with its semi-reliance on enemy turns for damage. Now, of course, that's not to say that you need to pull side grades. A lot of meta DPS right now already have non-overlapping supports built into their teams already. Archer has Sparkle and maybe Hanya, the Herda has Serval and Mini Herda, the latter for whom she is actually the most reliant on in pure fiction funnily enough, and Finon has Bronya and potentially Yukong for shorter fights, just to name a few examples. But perhaps, the next time you think about who to pull, you shouldn't just be asking, how low can this character perform in terms of cost? You should also be asking, who is in that low-cost team, and does my character steal or perhaps even enable any of my commonly contested characters? And if so, is that loss worth it? After all, opportunity cost is its own cost, and there is no better example of that than us, the main character of this story, and the least niche support of them all. Thanks for watching.